χρώμα, μήκος τριχοφυΐας, τατού, άλλα επιφανειακά identifiers, καταγραφή ενδυμάτων, καταγραφή προσωπικών αντικειμένων, οδοντόγραμμα, δειγματοληψία, σχόλια.
I wouldn't say they look anxious. Sometimes they look peaceful, other times they just look wrong. Because it's a person that used to be alive and they have all of the characteristics and the facial features that they had when they were alive, but something is off. You can't really tell what, but something is off. Now what our technicians are doing, they will try to beautify the faces, so they will apply some makeup. Because the first thing that people observe when they see a dead body is the paleness, because they look very, very pale. So they try to counteract that with some makeup to make them look slightly more alive and like they're sleeping. They will glue the eyelids shut, they will glue the mouth shut so that it doesn't open. And then, yes, they look very peaceful and like they're sleeping. I'm a medical doctor. I graduated in 2022, and since then I'm pursuing the specialization in forensic medicine. I liked the idea of becoming a voice for the dead, and at the same time, it's sort of like a puzzle, like a mystery that you need to unfold and speak for people that are no longer here to speak for themselves. So I guess it sounded noble in my teenage head, and it still sounds noble in my adult head, so that is why. So when we get bodies from the shipwreck, I wouldn't say that is an average day. Things are very different. Just to give you an idea of what the mortuary looks like, you have a long corridor, and as you enter from the back door, you have a viewing room for families. You go through the viewing room, and then to your right, you have the autopsy room, where we have 2 autopsy tables, and to the left, we have a room with 1 table where we perform the embalmings for the bodies. And then if you keep down that corridor, we have offices. So every day when you walk in, the first thing you see is bodies. We don't have enough space, so the bodies are everywhere. When we get a shipwreck, because we are talking about a lot of people, and we don't have space for them. So we have 7 spots in our refrigerating units, and at least 5 of them are usually full with previous casework or bodies that are being kept there until the funeral. So for me, the first experience in a shipwreck was very shocking, because I entered the morgue and there were bodies everywhere. Some of them were lying, like 2 or 3 bodies in 1 table, because we had no place for them and we didn't want to leave the bodies on the floor. So it was overwhelming in the sense of spatial capacity. We couldn't move, couldn't take a step. You had to walk sideways in order to go by the bodies without touching them. The shipwrecks in specific usually entail deceased young people. It's sort of like a scene where you see dead kids everywhere. And I would say that can be quite shocking, even to experienced professionals. And obviously to people that are not used to working with fresh bodies, it can be quite overwhelming. So my first time was this December. It was a lethal shipwreck with 17 casualties. They were all males. They were all very young. Most of them were not adults. And so I was called at 7 in the afternoon from the Coast Guard to tell me that there has been an incident. We have 17 dead people and we need to transport them to the morgue. I had to wait for a couple of hours because the bodies were coming from a different part of the island. And there were some logistic issues about who can transport that many bodies. Then the bodies arrived. And our technicians started moving the bodies from the cars into the mortuary. And I remember thinking that they are so many, and what are we going to do about them? So that first night was, yes, the first night was overwhelming. We had to move all 17 bodies for their CT scans. I think I was there until 3 in the morning trying to get everything in order. We didn't have enough refrigerating spaces for the bodies. Sadly, we didn't have any assistance from the state either. So me and my colleagues, we had to personally call people like butchers and ask them to donate a refrigerating truck that we could park in front of the morgue so that we could store the bodies there. So I want to say that was a bit surreal, calling butchers in the middle of the night, just asking for scraps, basically. We managed to get one of those trucks through a personal favor. So they brought the truck over. I had to stay over and oversee the movement of the bodies. The first truck they brought was too big to enter the yard of the hospital, so it had to be parked on the street outside the hospital. And so we had to call the police and request for a police escort to guard the truck throughout the night until we started with the examination in the mornings. I went home, I showered, I slept for maybe 4 hours, and then I went back to the hospital to start with the intake and the formal initiation of the investigation. I remember I had to call the CSI technicians on the way to tell them to come over and get the fingerprints. They came over. They could not get fingerprints because after long exposure in water, they become wrinkled. I think everyone has noticed that after staying too long in the shower or in a bath. So I had to inject saline underneath the fingertips to bloat them a little bit so that the fingerprints were visible for the CSI techs to collect them. And then I thought that we need to somehow organize our thinking because it was the first time I was doing anything of the sorts. I had been reading about it, but reading about things and then actually having to deal with it are two very, very different things. And then me and my colleague Effie, we started going through the room, taking a look at their faces, starting with the photography. I remember thinking they are so young. When you are striving to identify someone, every little thing has to be recorded and photographed. In reality, with migrant deaths, DNA is not particularly useful for most countries anyway, because at least in Europe, they will not accept DNA samples that do not come from the European Union. So even if you have family members, let's say in Egypt, and they have a dead person who is in Greece, and they want to contribute DNA in order to make the identification, Europe will not allow us to get that person's DNA from Egypt to compare it to our dead person. That is a matter of legislation. And so in reality, all of those primary identifiers, that is what Interpol calls them, and that is DNA, fingerprints, medical records, and so on, they are not available for migrants. So it's all very, very visual in a sense. So we will receive photographs from the missing people. They usually come to us through an NGO. Because the families are reluctant to go to the police, rather. Usually they're illegal in the country, so obviously they will not go to the police to report them missing. So we'll receive data from an NGO, we will scan through the photographs while we have the body there. We'll try to look for any kind of familiarity. First, the overview of the features, and then we'll try to find smaller details that will confirm our suspicion, like if someone has a mole over their lip or if there is a tiny scar between the eyes, things like that. And we will try to find things that match between our body, our post-mortem photograph, and the ante-mortem photograph of the missing person. When dealing with unidentified bodies, undressing the body, photographing the body is the most important part because that is what will lead you to the identification. Then I had to collect urine samples, so we tried to collect biological samples as early as possible. And I remember going for urine sample. So in order to do that, you use a syringe and you go over the skin to pierce the urinary bladder and remove the urine. And I remember it was very easy, which is usually not the case for cases that we normally work with for two reasons. The first one is that usually the bodies have a normal weight or they are overweight. So there's a big gap of fatty tissue between the skin surface and the urinary bladder, and that was not the case with our migrants. And the second thing was that the bladders were very full, which initially gave you the idea that they were so packed inside the ship that they could not pee. And I think that was shocking, thinking about how things were happening on the days prior to the bodies being found and how they were deprived of your basic biological needs, such as eating or even peeing. And that was a bit shocking, I want to say. But yeah, I think that those were my first thoughts, and then I thought we really need to identify them. We don't have a great track record in Greece and generally in Europe, I want to say, about identification of migrants. So I knew the stats. I knew that in most cases you have some identification rates that are 40%, 50%. So about half of the people are never identified and they get buried in unmarked graves, which is not dignifying for anyone. But we managed to identify over 80% of the people within 48 hours. And I have to say that was mostly because we were working out of hours, because if we were all to leave at 3 o'clock when our shift ends, nothing would have been done. So I would take photos with me at home to edit them and forward them to the embassy so that they could make communication with the family. So it took a lot of personal effort, not just for me, for the entire team, I want to say. And I think at the end of the day, despite all of the sadness of the whole incident, because obviously it's a sad thing, it makes me feel good that I can somehow help people get that closure. And I think at the end of the day, it validates my reasons for wanting to go into forensic medicine.